of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Today we're beginning a 5-week journey together called Mindful Communication Challenge. I want to start with a story that wasn't shared today in our readings. It's a story about Jesus being in the home of Mary and Martha. It's an interesting story. So Jesus is in their home, and those sisters are there, and Mary is sitting at the feet of the Lord listening to him teach. And Martha's scurrying around the house doing all kinds of work and preparation, and Martha's complaining because Mary isn't helping her. And Jesus says, well, Mary has chosen the good part. That's the right thing to be doing. So I ask you a question. What would you be doing if that was you? Would you be checking Facebook? I don't know. Doing the dishes, straightening up, making sure all the chores were done? Or would you do what Mary was doing, was sitting down and listening to the Lord who's in your home speaking to you? Would you be able to be present there and listen? And I know it's a challenge. It's a challenge for us, and it gets more challenging, I think, all the time because of the way that we are fed information now. It comes very quickly to us. It's hard to pay attention. It's hard to sit and just listen. There's so many distractions. And Martha, you can see that with her. She's distracted by many things. You are worried and troubled over many things, but one thing is needed, and Mary has chosen that good part. She's sitting there, she's listening. Our subject today is listening. That's a big part of our communication. So I start with that story just to say, yep, there's the Lord saying it's important to listen. Make sure you don't miss something, especially an important opportunity like that. And then the story of the sower is another similar story where Jesus tells this parable about the sower, who is the Lord, who goes out to sow. And he casts seed among different types of ground. And it's a picture of the Lord sharing his word, sharing his teachings with us, with his people. And how do we respond to that? Are we that hard ground earth? Are we that place too many distractions? Or evils of our life are choking out those good things? Or have we prepared our mind, the soil of our mind, so that when something comes to it, it can take root and grow? So you look at that hard ground, that hard-headedness, that packed down. We've already made up our minds. We already know what is right, or we've already decided for ourselves what we believe, and so nothing can really take root. So thinking about that kind of attitude when we hear what's spoken, I already got it figured out. In the birds of the air, picture the falsities that come through and justify it, justifications of our mind. Like, well, this is right, and here's why. I don't need that. Then we think about the soil with all the stones, a little bit of soil, that ego, that self puts or pushes things out. Sure, we can get excited for a while, but it doesn't last because it's not deep. We don't have depth there. It's just a superficial thing. And then the ground with the weeds pictures those bad habits or evils that choke out the truth when it does show up in our mind. But if we will examine ourselves, look at our lives, and remove the kinds of evils that we might see, the distractions, the dysfunctions, and so on that crop up in our lives that are really well pictured. If you're a gardener, you can probably imagine it very well. It's like you go to hit a patch of ground that hasn't been cared for. There's a lot of preparation. You can't just go out and say, well, I want to have vegetables, so I'll just toss these out into the field there. You know that there's going to be rocks in the way. There's going to be weeds most likely. There might be noxious weeds, those kinds of things. It takes some work. Just like learning about what's true and having it become part of who we are takes effort on our part. But when we prepare the soil, when we break open the hard places in ourselves, remove those rocks, remove the weeds, things can grow. Like this passage that from the Heavenly Doctrines, it says, but in very deed, the moment you shun evils as sins, the Lord inflows from heaven, takes away the veil, dispels the cloud, opens the spiritual mind, and so introduces you to heaven. It's a pretty nice picture. As soon as we do that, the veil is removed. The Lord can flow in and show us into that way of being. So what attitudes do we approach hearing the word with is what that story brings to mind. What mindsets is the truth greeted by when we hear it? Now, if we turn our attention to communication, one key to communication is listening. So if we use this story as a parallel, what type of attitude, what type of mindset do people encounter when they try to speak to us, when they try to share with us, when we try to listen? What is their story greeted by? One important thing to start out by saying is that we can listen to somebody better if we are in the moment, if we aren't somewhere else. So I have this display that I'm going to share with you for a moment. We have our past, we have our present, we have our future. And if I asked you, took a survey, all right, who has things right now that are troubling you? And we'll say, well, we have a couple things that are hard right now, and I find it pretty distracting, so they're stacked up in my life. I've got some issues that I'm dealing with, right? Do you have more? Should I add some more? Is anyone having a particular hard time? So I'll maybe add some more to that. So yeah, the present moment is difficult. Now, most likely we can handle that. What often happens, though, is we start to look at our past life and go, well, I really messed up when I was young. I didn't do all the right things. I probably didn't raise my kids right. And I didn't go to church. Whatever. No. Whatever you want to throw in there. You can have, this stack can get pretty high with all the things of our past that we regret. Right? So that's fine. They're there. We're not going to think about them too much. But what about the future? Anyone worry about the future? You troubled by what might happen tomorrow, next week, 10 years, 5 years? So we have our anxieties about the future. That one's going to cause trouble. That must be a very slippery slope. But you can imagine, because I'm sure that you do it like I do, is that we anticipate the bad things that are going to happen. So we have anxiety about the future. We have regret about the past. And it's okay if we can stay in the present moment, because we can deal with these things most of the time. But what happens is often we stack up, we bring all of that stuff into the present moment with us. So I just start to, and that stuff is hard. And it's going to be even worse when that happens, and it just gets overwhelming. And then you can imagine the present moment is getting more difficult to deal with, right? To the point where eventually it's overwhelming, right? That's the point. The point is, if we can't live in the present moment because we're adding all of the regret of the past and anxiety about the future, it becomes overwhelming for us. So listening or anything else in our life can become possible, can become more doable if we can live in the present moment. Listen to this. It says, the writings say, the more interior and perfect angels, or it says, the more interior and perfect angels are, the less do they care about things of the past or think about those of the future. And that this is also the origin of their happiness. Their ability to not worry about that past or the future is the origin of their happiness. Does that make sense? Seems to make sense, because they're just dealing with a moment. Right now it's okay. Lao Tzu, the father of Taoism, says if you are depressed, you are living in the past. If you are anxious, you're living in the future. If you are at peace, you are living in the present. So our subject over these 5 weeks is mindful communication. And it's a challenge to communicate, we know that. And it will take us actually being mindful, which means really paying attention. Am I going to take the time to really pay attention to how I am approaching this communication, how I am entering into it? So we begin by listening. So what does it mean to listen? Well, we probably all have different definitions of what that means. If I ask you, what does it mean for you to listen? Or if you're asking someone to listen to you, what does that mean? We probably all have disagreement about what that actually means, but we know that if someone isn't listening to us, that we probably have negative feelings about that. We feel brushed aside. We feel unimportant. We feel ignored, right? Disrespected. So we might also, just to make it more complicated, we probably have different demands for different people in our life. There's a famous book on the differences between men and women. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Maybe you read it. And whenever you generalize, you're going to get it wrong. So I'm saying that knowing that I'm generalizing, but he did it. I'm just sharing it with you. He says that women just want to be heard. You want to have a conversation, they just want to be heard. Don't fix it. Just hear me. But men want to fix the problems that they hear the women sharing with them or anybody else. And so you can see right there, if you have two people who are trying to interact, who are, let's say, in a marriage where they have that situation, it's going to present difficulty because they have different definitions or expectations when it comes to listening. As a parent, if you're a parent, what does listening mean to you? I would guess it probably means listening to me means you hear what I say and you promptly respond and do it, right? Isn't that what we often expect and hope? And that's why probably there's a lot of anxiety or stress in parenting. You hear me, so you will obey. Well, that's a different expectation than maybe your child had. Well, I heard you. Well, aren't you going to do it? Well, you didn't say do it. You said listen. So I listened. That can happen in marriage relationships as well, or other relationships. For example, if we're asked for advice, say your partner asks you for advice and you share your advice with them and they don't do it, like, well, why'd you ask me if you're not going to do what I said? I was just interested in what you thought. Well, if you want my opinion, you're probably going to follow it, right? So you can see how the expectations can cause conflict. Friends often can have a simpler time of it because they get together for a sympathetic ear, you share stories, and there's no expectation necessarily that you're going to fix it or change it. The heavenly doctrines tell us that there's a living relationship or a correspondence between our ears and hearing or obedience. So the ears correspond to listening and obeying. And people wore earrings back in those days as a sign of obedience. So they wore them to represent, it's not just important to hear, but to obey. So if there's an expectation, especially in the Old Testament, the Lord says something, you will hear and obey. All that the Lord has spoken, we will do and hear. It's not just about listening, it's about responding. There's another quote, it says, to hear as being to attend, that is to observe with attention and to hearken or obey. For the things that enter by the hearing are not only seen by the understanding, but also if they are in accord with our affection, they are obeyed. So when it comes to spiritual things, the expectation might be not just to hear it, but hear it and do something about it. Observe with attention and obey it. So the question is, well, how good are we at that? How good are we at hearing what was said from the Word or hearing what the Lord says and saying, okay, I'm going to do that? Sometimes we look for the loophole. Well, I heard you said that, but there's got to be a way around that. Or maybe you didn't really mean it that way, or maybe I have a special exception. The Lord says, quote, blessed are those who hear the word of God and keep it or obey it. The suggestion is, if we really want to be happy, when we hear what the Lord says, to respond to that, to obey it. And we know that doesn't always happen. So what are some of the blockages that we might have to listening? Why do some people have a hard time listening? One thing is that people are hurting. People are suffering. They're having a hard time. Exodus chapter 6, verse 8 says, I will bring you into the land that I swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord. Moses told this to the Israelites, but they would not listen to Moses because of their broken spirit and their cruel slavery. So that's what it says there. Yeah, the children of Israel heard these things, but because of their broken spirit and the cruel slavery that they experienced, they were not able to respond. There's too much pain around their own lives, and they couldn't separate that or give themselves to other people. Now, you probably know from your own experience, if you've been very sick at some point in your life or disabled in some way, it's not a time where you necessarily have the strength or the energy to be there for somebody else, to really hear someone. If you're starving, your attention is on yourself. The idea is to get fed, to get well, so from there we can be in a place to be helpful. And I do want to say we don't have to try to be a therapist, but do recognize that everybody has their own story. Everybody has their own hurts, have their own history, their own pain that might be impacting their ability to really hear. Other thing is they may not have any incentive to hear you. What's in it for me? You see that show up in the children of Israel quite often they would listen to the Lord when they were in trouble, when things were bad. But once things smoothed out, they sort of forgot about it. They didn't really listen. The book of Judges is all about that. You just go read that book and you'll see that things are great. We don't listen to the Lord, but when the enemy comes and destroys us, takes us over, I forgot, Lord, help me. And the Lord helps them out, and then they remember. So, and Pharaoh's a good example of that. When Moses was trying to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt, it says, but when Pharaoh saw that there was a respite, he hardened his heart and would not listen to them, just as the Lord had said. So, a plague would come, and Pharaoh would say, yeah, I'll let the people go. And then the plague would be lifted, and he'd go, no, I'm okay. They're going to stay. There's also presumptions we might have. We might think we know what people are saying already. We might check out because, I know what they're going to say. I've heard that before. Or we finish people's sentences for them because we're so convinced, I know what you're going to say, so we just finish it right off. I mean, what a strange thing to do. But I understand why we do it, but it's a strange thing to do. We're told that we can process or hear something like 400 words a minute or some large number, but people usually speak at about 120. So we're just like, come on. We don't think about it that way, but we can process so much more that we can become impatient while we're waiting for someone to say what they're going to say. Which goes to the next one, which is we suffer from impatience. We're anxious to get on to something else, something maybe more important, or my TV show, or the game that's going to be on later. Can you just wrap it up because this game's about to start. Or we're so wrapped up again in what I'm going to say next. We're already processing that, right? Which leads us to our main problem, which is self-love or pride, or convinced that we already know. Our own way is right. What could you possibly say that could change my mind or change the way I'm thinking? Or we'll say, I'll listen to you as long as you tell me what it is I want to hear. But if you don't, then I'm going to check out. And that's the parable of the sower, that hard ground. We just can't, the seed does not take root. It can't penetrate. So to really listen to other people, we have to work on loving other people. Our concern for them will open up ourselves to be able to hear them. The writings say that pride of heart, which is self-love, drives the divine away from itself and puts heaven away from itself. For pride consists in loving self more than others, putting self before others, and wishing to rule other people. So if we have too much pride, we won't hear it either. So if we're all caught up in ourselves when we're communicating with somebody else, it will come forth as, that reminds me of the time that I had that. And then we'll shift the attention directly into our story. And that reminds me of when that happened to me. It's a human thing to do, but it's also not a great way to listen because we're immediately turning it to ourselves. So how do we listen well to other people? Are you still listening to me, by the way? I don't know. Probably not. People check in and out, and that's fine. But how can we listen better? One thing that we're asked to do is to listen carefully. Listen carefully. In Exodus it says, the Lord said, if you will listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight and give heed to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will not bring upon you any of the diseases that I brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. Listen carefully. One of the things I want to say about that is listen for the meaning of what the person is trying to share with them. Don't get too sidetracked by the words they're using, but listen to what it is that they want to convey. If you're angry at somebody, you're going to pick apart. If they use the wrong word, then you're just going to say, whoa, and stop. Just try to listen to what they're trying to say carefully. An exercise you can do is a do you mean exercise. So someone says something to you and you respond back, do you mean this? And they can say, no. Actually, I mean this. And they say it again, and then you say, well, do you mean this? And you keep doing that back and forth until you can say, yes, that's exactly what I meant. We don't usually take the time to communicate that way, which is probably why we have a lot of problems. But do we take the time to really say, this is what I meant? Did you mean that? Yes, that's what I meant. And then you can move on. The other way you can do it is complete your communication, that you say your message and you just feedback, I heard this. Okay. Simple thing to do. Why would you do that? To know that the message that you sent was received and heard. Second thing is listening with compassion. Exodus 22, it says, verse 27, and if your neighbor cries out to me, I will listen. for I am compassionate. Just listening to somebody with compassion. Listen what's behind what they're saying. Because everybody is hurting in some way. The key to listening to them is listening with their heart. What is it that they're trying to convey? What are the words saying? Not only that, but what is it that they're saying from behind that? You know, your child may go to school, have a horrible experience, and come home and start acting out. And you're figuring, you don't even stop to go, well, maybe they wonder what's going on there. This isn't normal. This isn't how they usually are. I wonder what's happening. Instead, we get upset because they didn't treat us nicely. Go, are you okay? The simple words, are you okay? Or what happened today could probably change the trajectory of a lot of conversations. So what's being said? Here's something that's very interesting that I found. It says that the number one cause of affairs in America, the number one cause of adultery is that, or why marriages break up, is somebody found a sympathetic ear somewhere else. It says most affairs don't start with a sexual attraction, they start with somebody who would listen to them and care about them. They found someone who looked them in the eye and say, you matter. I'm tuning into you, while the person at home is tuning out to them. So that is an attraction for them. It's even been said that a man is half in love with a woman who will listen to him. He's already half in love if there's someone who will listen to what he's saying. And I'm not saying to say that's good or it's okay. I'm just saying that's what they found. Those are the research. So how can we listen better? There's such a power with listening from compassion. There's not a need to fix it. You don't have to be a therapist for the person who's talking to you. Just say, thank you for sharing that with me. I appreciate that you shared that. Because I think there's a lot of pressure. We don't say things like this happens a lot. If someone went through a trauma, maybe they lost a loved one, and we sort of avoid them because we don't want to say the wrong thing. If we just say, sorry, or I'm here, or I care about you, if you ever want to talk about that. So listen with compassion. And listen attentively. Put away the distractions. Story of Mary and Martha. Mary was just sitting there listening. Can we get to that place where we do that? Instead of all this scurrying around that has to be done, turn off the computer, put away the phone, make the time to listen. Maybe if you have to schedule it. Make a date time that you know you have to get together and talk with one another. And listen with your eyes. 80% of communication is nonverbal. That's a huge amount. I've even heard that only 13% of communication is by words. The rest of it is through tone and what the gestures are that the person says, facial expressions, and so on. So one thing to say about that is if you have something sensitive to communicate with somebody else, try to get together with them to do it in person. A lot of misunderstandings can happen when we try to email a sensitive conversation or that kind of a thing. Find time to get together with the person. All right, so here's an example of that. Put your hands together, put your hand like this, put your two fingers together. Okay, and put them on your chin. Okay, how many of them you have it on your chin? Right? See, that just shows the power of body gestures, right? Some of you knew this was coming, so you thought, what word are you going to say? Chin. I say, oh. Well, we saw fingers on chin, but you saw this, so you went for that. It just shows the power of that, right? Doesn't make us unintelligent, it's just what we do. That's how we communicate. When Jesus was communicating with the rich young ruler, it just says, the text says, Jesus looked at him and loved him. I think there's a connection there. When you love people, you look at them. You look at them in the eye and you communicate with them. You have my undivided attention is what it tells them. You're valued. You are significant. You're worth listening to, and I'm going to take the time to hear you. I'm talking to parents, and I'm talking to myself here when I say this. When was the last time you stopped when your child had something to say? Maybe if they're short, got down on your knees and just got eye to eye with them and listened to them. It's easy to say, I'm great at this. My kids will probably grow up and go, yeah, I had a great view of my dad's back the whole time I was growing up because he was at the counter cooking and trying to communicate. So I know what the back of his head looks like. I don't know what the front of his face looks like. But so can we do more to engage them in conversation or stop and do something where we're face to face? And I know it's hard with schedules to stop and do that, but make time to show, because it says you're important to me, you matter. And I said it before, but I'll say it again, just listen. You do not have to fix it. You do not have to give advice. You do not have to solve the issue. You just have an obligation as a compassionate human being to listen. And you just say, thank you. Thank you. Cliche says we're given 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we listen twice as much as we speak, which is a good rule of thumb. Try to use these more. So I want to share with you as we're closing here this message from Cecil Osborne. He says, when I ask you to listen to me and you start giving me advice, you haven't done what I've asked. When I ask you to listen to me and you begin to tell me why I shouldn't feel that way, you're just trampling on my feelings. When I ask you to listen to me and you feel like you have to do something to solve my problem, you have failed me, strange as that seems. Listen. All I ask that you do is listen. Not talk, not do, just hear me out. When you accept as a simple fact that I do not feel what I feel, no matter how irrational, then I can quit trying to convince you and get about to the business of understanding it all. So please listen and just hear me. And if you want to talk, wait a minute for your turn, and I will listen to you. And it seems odd to talk about listening because it seems like a natural thing, but we do have to work on it. We have to work on how we listen to other people. It's a skill. And we have to look at the blockages in ourselves. What are those things that are in the way? What are my distractions? Is it my pride? Is it my sense of self-interest? Is it, am I in a state of disorder that I need to sort out? Are those the kinds of things that I need to work on? And there are a lot of distractions. Martha is very distracted in that story. And so are we often. But just take the moment to sit and listen. Amen.